we've got half an hour at least for discussion and elucidation. The challenge is to talk about policy, to talk about flood alleviation, and we're open for either questions or comments or points of information. Yeah, we might take three at a time, Surya, and then yeah, we'll. Can you write them down? Surya, you can get first.
Surya from ISAS. During the British period in India, Dr. Sir Arthur Cotton, and later in the early years of India's independence, Dr. K.L. Rao, the engineer statesman, they had advocated the linking of Ganga, the Narmada, Godavari, Krishna, and Kaveri. Has there been any study done on that aspect in relation to flooding in India? And so what are the results? Thank you.
We'll take, we're looking over the front. Yeah, please.
Okay, my name is Tang Li. I'm known in ISAS circles as a blogger, but unknown to everybody. I used to be the public relations man working for the public utilities board in Singapore. Now, one of the issues that I think, if you want to talk about policy, was do you feel that water subsidies that many Indian states give have actually been created inefficiencies in water management, and would there be political ramifications in lifting state subsidies?
Professor Shin.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I want to start with one question about the science. First of all, to think in terms of frequency of floods. Now, if you take large floods, let's say, these are daily probability events. And for example, one in 100-year flood, if you take the 25-year data, the probability of occurrence is 44. Now, the data that you are usually able to quantify is for India, for example, is post-Indian to the detailed quantification, and that's at most 60 or 20. Now, so for tail probability events, designing a policy, either preventive, that is the structural policy, or curative, after flood occurs, you do whatever it is needed to address that response to the floods or events that you have not built in your structures, and it has a probability of occurring in Tasman. So you have to go beyond your structures to have response capabilities in the event. So that's one problem. So you are supplementing qualitative data with the sediment analysis. But all these data have times of error.
Correct.
And they vary. It is not the same for one type of data and that type of data. So it's understandable in my view that the policymakers don't spend too much time in addressing the basic science or the fundamentals, and they address only what they think is immediately remediable, or they can do something about. So, as the old saying goes, when you lose your key somewhere in a dark place, but you search for it where you have a light. And this is the nature. I didn't quite get from your presentation. What is your suggestion for going beyond what we know, what you have nicely described, what we don't know? Where do we go? That's my question. That's number one. Number two is I'm an economist, I should address. So the economic effects or social effects. Now you mentioned the displacement effect of flood. Now I think of the other side. Flood in the monsoon season provides moisture for the off-monsoon Rabi season. And so what you lose by way of a crop in the flood season, you are gaining, or you might gain, be compensated, but what you do, you are able to do in the next succeeding season. So if you take the year as a whole, it may balance out. We may not see the effect of the flood at all in terms of total food grain output or any other output measure. So again, simplistic analysis of focusing only on the flood end of the story and not thinking through what could happen in the short run or in the long run is another problem in flood analysis. So every drought is the most severe drought in memory, and every flood is treated as most severe flood in memory. With no thinking, no analysis whatever of any frequency analysis or any other scientific underpinning of what you might call the extreme drought or extreme flood.
There's three very first two. But thanks for those questions. The linking, the river linking project that you described, or mentioned, it seems to have died, as best I can judge. Certainly, one of the ideas was to try to take the water off the peak flows out of the Ganga, particularly, and move it to southern rivers. That is a proposition that is full of difficulties, engineering difficulties particularly. And that was recognised fairly early on by the critics of the scheme. For those of you who don't know, this is a gigantic idea to move water all over India, mainly out of the water-rich areas to some. I'm sorry, it's not working. Oh, no, just one second. Can you hear me now? Yeah. You can hear me? Okay. So taking water out of the Ganga, for example, at peak flow and moving it into other rivers was going to be an engineering challenge, to put it mildly, and a very expensive one. It didn't seem to most of the commentators to be something that was particularly feasible. But of course, there are also going to be huge issues with aquatic ecology and water quality, of taking the water out of the Ganga, for example, which is particularly badly polluted, and then polluting other rivers which were less polluted was another issue. So it was, it didn't seem to be a real solution to the problem. So with regard to the water subsidies and inefficiencies, in the presence of Professor Srinivasan, perhaps I should not make any comments. It just strikes me as being extraordinary that so much groundwater can be used so cheaply in northern India, at almost no cost at all to the farmer community, and watch the groundwater levels fall. Sustainability has become an industry worldwide, and trying to find indicators of sustainability is an issue that has kept many people employed. One of the simplest indicators or indices of sustainability is whether you're taking more groundwater out than it's going in. And in northern India, it clearly is the case. And also in northern China, and many other parts of the world, including my own country. So, and you have to wonder what happens in a few decades' time when the groundwater is at a level where it's extremely expensive to pump, etc. For tens of millions of people, it's probably a disaster slowly developing. Or should I go on, Kathy?
Well,
Or do you want me to distinguish colleague? Do you want me to continue, or do you want to say something on those two?
You have to go on the...
Well, the probability of floods issues is, you're quite right. There is some black magic involved in those calculations from relatively short gauge records. Engineers and engineering hydrologists have a couple of tricks that they use. One of them is to fit a probability density function to gauge data and then extrapolate from that. The other is to simulate flows over very long periods of time. The first has, I think, some mathematical and statistical veracity. The second has always struck me as being a very strange way of proceeding. But I've had this argument with hydrologists for many years and never won. So there are some issues, as you rightly say. There are problems of extrapolation. The paleo flood data, I didn't have time today to present the magnitude data. We're not just concerned with frequency, but we can actually model the magnitude of the flood. In that Banswara site that I briefly showed you a photograph of, we're in the process of doing that at the moment. It's a hydraulic model to calculate the discharge. Some of the discharges are absolutely terrifying. In fact, for the 1894 flood, we know what it was because the British actually recorded it. And it was around about 45,000 cubic meters per second. You'd be lucky to get more than 2,000 cubic meters per second in the canal in Singapore. So 45,000 cubics is a gigantic flood. And yet there are hydroelectric plants being built all the way along the Alaknanda Valley in blind ignorance of this prospect. You made the argument, I believe, that one of the reasons why policymakers may not use this information is because it's quite different, of a different kind. Yet Kale, this Indian guy who's been doing this excellent work, he's demonstrated there is actually conformity between where there's a period of overlap between the paleo record and the modern record. He gets the same numbers. So it's not as if they're telling a very different story. And yet he, along with his former PhD supervisor, have really struggled to break through the sort of blockage of power, if you like, that is largely the engineering profession. It seems to me, though, that if I was simply focused on trying to calculate the magnitude frequency spectrum of floods in India or any other country for that matter, it would, you could argue along the lines that we did. But we're here talking about policies to do with embankments, where the chief engineer of Bihar in 1937 set out in a brilliant paper all of the problems that we now know have gone on with embankments. And one of those problems, you talk about the balancing out of water during the dry and wet seasons. Yeah, that'd be fine if it weren't for the fact that the embankments actually stop most of the floodplain getting water. And so farmers actually then have to irrigate from tube wells during the dry season. There are hundreds of thousands of people trapped inside the embankments in UP and Bihar. And they have real problems when a flood comes along, as you might imagine. So it isn't, I don't know of any analysis of the kind that you're suggesting, and I think it's a very good idea. But I can't imagine that it would come out quite the way you suggest. I could be wrong, but I might doubt it. Yeah, so that's probably.
Thank you.
I guess we just to add that in some ways we could look at it as a problem of lock-in. But once there are embankments, that leads to set conditions, and to shift policy is going to get very difficult. And we see this across many parts of Asia, that particularly previous engineering work, in some cases going back a long way in history, creates a set of conditions from which it's very difficult to backtrack and to change policy objectives. So I think from this we get a kind of continuation that we have to keep with the same set of ideas, and it's very difficult for new thinking to break through.
And Dr. Chaudhary and Dr. Fowler, thank you.
Well, thank you for two excellent presentations. My question is from a policy perspective. You've spoken of embankments, engineering works, but these in the upper riparian region often have tremendous ramifications for floods in the lower riparian areas. I shan't talk of the Indus, but I'll certainly talk of the Ganges, because that's where where upper riparian works like at Faraka, etc., are tremendously exacerbated the problem for lower riparian regions. As an answer to that, as a response to that, would you recommend, in terms of policy, a regional flood management arrangement combining I'm Swan, it's a huge political China, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan?
Just
But there's no getting away from this, because irrespective of whatever both of you have said, ultimately for me, and I've been in the policy area for many, many years, the problem of floods has always been this inability to reach an agreement without the regulations.
David mentioned about the role of climate and floods, spoke of the frequency of floods, current and shifts. I'm just wondering about the coordination of policies in this class. You also mentioned that forests directly do not contribute to the prevention of floods. If climate is the risk, probably forests have been there. Reforestation is up the urban season. Does that mean that the flood policy has to be dealt with exclusively on the policy? Is there any interconnection? I mean, honestly, I don't see this happening in a country like India. I don't even see this happening in bigger countries in the world, because this kind of unconnected coordination, if I want to that, is very important. But evidence doesn't exist as to what exactly are the results of what policies.
David Taylor, I'm a professor of geography at the US also. Very interesting presentations. I've got a couple of points really. The first one relates to the sediment records. My area of research is sediment and using sediment to reconstruct environmental history. And I think we ignore the power of the sediment record at our peril. And I just minded of work that was done in Japan about 7 years ago, based on some examination of coastal sediments in northeast Japan. And in that examination it was revealed major tsunamis in the past. And the two researchers who were doing that work realised that there was a return interval of major tsunamis in northeast Japan of 700 years, and the last one was 1300 AD, and the next one was to be expected any time now. And that was published in 2005, 2006. And of course, everybody ignored it and went ahead with power stations, etc., etc. Went ahead with maintaining those nuclear power stations, etc., etc. In an area that was known to have a severe tsunami hazard risk. The second point that I just wanted to make, and again that relates to an earlier point that also has been made. And it relates to some work that was done in the UK. I'm very conscious of Abby being next to me, because Abby was based in Leeds University for a while. There was some work done at Leeds University on flood management in Yorkshire, Rydale, I think, in part of Yorkshire. And in the UK, because money has been so difficult to obtain over the last few years, the Environment Agency that manages flood risk has had to have a priority list of areas where flood management takes place. And unfortunately, that priority list excludes many rural areas. So in some rural areas now, though there's a likelihood of flood, there's no money to protect against those floods made available by the government. Local people responded to that by developing their own flood responses. And I just wonder to what extent we are over-reliant on government when it comes to these kinds of things. And so we heard just earlier about the difficulty of managing floods in this area, where it's a transboundary issue, and expecting governments perhaps to come together with some coordinated policy responses is perhaps expecting a bit too much. And so to what extent perhaps local communities taking over that responsibility?
Back to the panel. With regard, is this working? With regard to regional management, despite Professor Taylor's again naysaying, I think the answer has to be yes. It is. You cannot manage the floods in Bangladesh without knowing what's coming down the river from India, or indeed what the management changes are likely to be in India. Equally, you can't manage floods terribly readily and this is less true in Pakistan, because the size of the Indus catchment in India is not very large by comparison with the size of the catchment in Pakistan. So it's it's politically fraught, as you rightly say, but it seems to me essentially sharing data and information. India's got vastly superior capability to do research and investigations than Bangladesh or Pakistan, for that matter. It does a lot of it. If that information can be shared with its neighbours, it could help, I think, immeasurably. That said, the Bangladeshis are more open in providing data and information than the Indians are. You can get data out of the Bangladeshis. You go to the Central Water Commission in Delhi, you get an awful lot of tea, but not a lot of data. It's very nice tea. So that's that one. The floods versus the vegetation. I have been deliberately have exaggerated slightly. For the record, the Himalayan record that I briefly touched on, our current interpretation of that is that those floods, and we've got 1,000 years of floods there now, those floods are probably the result of what are called landslide dam outburst floods. So you get an earthquake or you get a large rainstorm in the upper catchment. This creates a huge landslide which then blocks the river. Then you get a large natural dam forming behind that, and that dam then breaks and creates a massive flood downstream. This occurred, it's been documented by the British in 1894 and again by the Indians in 1970. In the same valley, interestingly, the Virahi Ganga, the river, the Valley of Sorrows, and it's well named. And so the rainfall that fills these dams is actually amplified by the presence of the dam. And when they break, it's an absolutely devastating flood. The dam in the Virahi Ganga was about 300 meters high. Huge. So we do know also that deforestation of part of that catchment actually did lead to landslides in 1970, which then plunged into the lake and then caused part of the reason that lake then burst was because of the sediment coming from the landslides from the deforested land. So vegetation does play some role, but it's not the role that most hydrologists, etc., will claim. With regard to climate change and your policy question, the issue is, will climate change drive more of these landslides? And indeed glacial outburst floods in the Himalayan. And the evidence suggests yes. In which case, from that process, we can expect more and more of these floods. So I would not wish to see the climate change and flood policies disconnected for that reason. But I'm not sure that that's the reason that is in the minds of the policymakers in Delhi. I'm not at all sure about it. No.
It's very difficult to infer from what we have now, how the relative frequencies of floods are going to change because of the global warming.
I agree. The models are inconsistent with each other. I agree with you entirely. However, the only consistency in the global change models, global climate change models for that part of the world, is that rainfall intensity will increase. Even though the rainfall may go down or go up. Take your choice. And also, the role of aerosols, black carbon, etc., is confusing the whole picture. But rainfall intensity is likely to increase. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But so it's a scenario-based analysis that you need to do rather than relying upon deterministic models. David Taylor's making the point, I think, about the use of these sedimentary records. It is not, I agree with you entirely, as you would imagine. And it is not a straightforward matter to get this sort of information in front of policymakers in a way that is understandable, because it is so unusual. It's stuff that people are not very familiar with. I think that Professor Srinivasan's comment about probabilities probably springs to mind. Was this the return period of tsunamis of 700 years, or were they equally spaced every 700 years?
They were equally spaced.
They were equally spaced. That's extraordinary. In which case, they probably should have taken notice of it. And I think over-reliance on governments, yeah. The more I look at governments, the more I'm horrified by what I see in terms of public policy, and particularly in Australia, which is our environment has been going down the hill for decades, and we've had increasing numbers of policies and interventions and legislation, etc. what's the alternative? To rely upon local communities? Yes, they can do something locally. And of course the Chipko movement in India, which was actually born in the Upper Ganga catchment and has taken off worldwide as the tree huggers, which of course is not actually what Chipko means, but never mind. And nobody actually hugged the trees, apparently, except for journalist photographs, I'm told. They can do local things, but it has to be within a larger framework, otherwise it has very little effect. If you rely upon the environmental movement, you get very strange outcomes quite often. The environmental movements in the Himalaya have their own agendas, and it's really difficult even to get them to take science very seriously, because they have their own agendas. So I think it's a mix of NGOs, government, and local communities that you probably need to have on site. Okay.
Yeah, if I could add to this argument about reliance on government, I won't talk so much about India, but perhaps come back to Singapore. Last year, I think it was last year, I was asked to take part in a live TV recording for Channel News Asia, a debate about floods in Singapore. I'm looking at our former PUB spokesman, because PUB refused to participate in this program. And like most of the invitations to go and talk to Channel News Asia, I'm doing a lot of Google searching before I go on to find out what people's reactions are. It was extraordinary, the public reaction to the flash floods in Singapore in terms of the absolute criticism that this should happen, the disbelief that there would be flooding in Singapore, and calls that this is somebody's responsibility to fix this. Whether that's just the Singapore perception or whether that's widespread through Asia, it's kind of interesting to find out. But we are seeing some evidence of local communities taking action, taking interest in flood management issues, in river restoration type movements. I've actually been in Chengdu in China for quite a bit of time in the last few months. In fact, I'm going back there tomorrow evening, and actually a couple of my research assistants are coming out to work with me next week to talk to some of the local community groups about perceptions of floods and river management in this area. And again, what's interesting is community groups in Chengdu, in the city, looking at water quality issues, it's not clear if they've decided or whether they've kind of been pushed by local government reps, that this is a problem that's caused by people outside the city. It's caused by pollution from the agricultural land, causing the city problem. So again, the focus is to get the urban communities to go out and work with the rural communities to kind of explain their responsibility to the city. So we're trying to get an understanding of how these local communities work. I mentioned Zach, who's going to be working in Jakarta, and again looking at the local communities around some of these rivers where flooding is a serious issue in terms of their everyday practices, if you like, of looking at issues such as garbage disposal, governance systems that affect that. So I think there's plenty of work to be done in terms of understanding how local communities react to policy, but also the way in which they are starting to really have some kind of bottom-up influence on policy.
We'll take one more round. Professor Hassan and two questions.
I just wanted to know if there is any place you can mention best practice. I was going to say whether Australia is doing well, but in Ohio and Mississippi Valley, when I remember they used to brag about that they are doing very, very good job. Is there any place you can think of, either in Europe, United States, where the flood management through public policies have been successful? The second one just has a relatively minor issue. I grew up in West Punjab. There's no river anywhere around, but there used to be floods all the time. Well, not all the time, every 10 years. And they used to absolutely devastate the bridges and the roads used to be just destroyed, and it was very inconvenient. And my impression was it's nothing to do with the river management. It's just the lack of drainage, and also basically the water used to run along the gradients of the earth and basically devastate a lot of villages. Is there a difference between the word flood? I always associate with rivers. What I'm saying is actually that I lived in areas where there was no river nearby, but there was still a lot of floods. I mean, not a lot of floods, but floods that I do remember. I have memories of them.
I don't know a lot of people. I'm Dan Freese, also from geography, a faculty member interested in coastal management and mangroves. And I really saw a nice link between the Calder's graph, where reforestation doesn't have a huge impact on the large floods, but it does on kind of the day-to-day and the series floods. And I think exactly the same parallel can be drawn with mangroves, where mangroves are great for day-to-day tides and small flooding events and storms, but when it comes to tsunamis and the real big high magnitude events, it's tricky because obviously after the tsunami in Asia, a huge amount, millions and millions of dollars came into mangrove research on the back of the protective role of mangroves in tsunamis. And actually, after the tsunami, there was quite a robust scientific debate that actually mangroves weren't that good against tsunamis. But they are good for these smaller events. Like, I would love to draw that same graph for mangroves. But there's an issue here. That you don't want to bite the hand that feeds, right? Because those big magnitude events where it was first thought that they had a big role, provided all this money. So I guess the question I want to ask you, maybe this is a question that you were looking to be answered for the audience, was how do you tell policymakers that the reforestation policy for large floods is wrong, even if that's the driver of the policy?
Okay. I know we may have talked about some of this stuff before, but I think my question kind of goes along with Dan's, and especially I want to ask you with the distinguished audience that we have here is the difference between a policy that's based on incorrect science but implemented correctly versus one that is well conceived but unable to be implemented due to institutional weaknesses and those kind of things. Is there a way that you've seen any distinction between that? Is there's at least from my short amount of work in Indonesia, it's very difficult to tell the difference between those two things.
We finished.
This is the last round. You got a cup of tea about that.
Excellent. We'll learn later. The West Punjab story is a very interesting one. Did you live anywhere near the Ramgunga?
Sorry?
The Ramgunga River? Did you live anywhere near that?
No.
No. So there is flooding on the plains of a local kind, just as a consequence of waterlogging. Some of those soils are almost impervious to moisture, and so you get waterlogging all over the place. And sometimes you see this manifested as surfacing and salinization of the soil, which of course renders it useless for agriculture. But of course you can be a long way away from a river and not know that water's coming from the river. But I suspect you're talking about waterlogging. I very rarely quote wisdom from Australian politicians, but there was a famous statement in 1974 when Brisbane flooded by the then Minister for Immigration, Al Grasby, when he said floodplains are for flooding on. And he's true, he's correct, he's true, he's dead now I think. But we've got to expect to get flooded if you live on a floodplain. And that's what the Gangetic Plain is, it's a gigantic floodplain. Mangroves and tsunamis, yeah, it's an unpopular message, Dan, I agree with you, but I don't see any alternative from a scientific viewpoint to use the best knowledge we've got. It won't be perfect and it will change, to tell the story as we see it. Whether that has consequences for funding, I don't know how you live with yourself, actually, not you specifically. I mean, I could. And I remember one of the first jobs I had when I joined the Australian Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation was to investigate why a lake was filling up with sediment and where the sediment was coming from. A theme I have stayed with for years. And we developed a series of techniques for this, and we came to the conclusion that the soil conservation effort had been focused on 5% of the problem. The other 95% had been ignored. And we told them that. We were not very popular. But frankly, did you want the lake to fill up with sediment or not? Was my driving force. So, truth will out. And I had the same response as that. The wrong policy implemented extremely well is still the wrong policy. The right policy implemented well is what you're aiming for. The right policy poorly implemented, of course, is not.
Either policy is designed without taking into account a priori that implementation will be a problem. It won't be a good policy.
That is true, and so you've got to be realistic as well in the design of the policy. I entirely agree. I just think we've tended to simplify our public policy so much to one-size-fits-all solutions that I think we've lost a lot of the significance of what we're trying to do. Equally, at least in Australia and elsewhere, the rise of managerialism in the public service has been a disaster, where all you need to do is know how to manage rather than actually knowing anything. And that, I mean, we have very senior bureaucrats who frankly know nothing, but they're very good managers.
Yeah, I might have one last word.
Okay. There was a very interesting paper written recently about some aspects of flood management in Australia. I mean, generally speaking, in terms of the restoration movement, the experience in Australia in terms of practitioners and new ideas is an area that we would turn to. Whatever Bob says that's disparaging about his fellow citizens, it's an area we turn to for some experience that we can consider. But even in the Australian context, there's been great difficulty overcoming some of the inertia associated with risk taking. So experimenting to see whether a retrofit idea to perhaps insert wetlands into an area and so on. In practice, it's a good idea. In actual implementation, there are many cases where it's very difficult for the people involved, for local government authorities to risk in case something goes wrong. So we seem to be in a situation where overcoming that risk and being able to experiment and being able to learn from experimentation is problematic.
Just the best practice question that Riaz left you with.
Yeah. Well, I think David is probably in the best position to answer that question. Let's just where's the example of best practice?
Oh, example of best practice.
The question being reflect.
Good question. Yeah, it's certainly hard to point to anywhere that has glowing success. I mean, it comes back to the point of people's expectations. The issue about floodplains being area where rivers flood is certainly a key concern. There's a movement now to, particularly in the Netherlands, to a policy of making space for rivers. Again, sort of backtracking from traditional engineering to thinking about appropriate land use rather than trying to engineer a solution for people in floodplains. So I suppose we could say Netherlands is a good example because of the precarious nature of this environment. Where there's been kind of holistic policy development for flooding. but floodplains will flood.
I think with that, we will leave it. If you have further questions that you'd like to address to the two speakers, there's tea waiting for us outside. But before we give them the customary ISIS round of applause, we have the customary ISIS presentation to make. One of our fine publications. Well, thank you very much. There is tea outside, and thank you for being such a nice audience.